I thought I had a fairly good idea of Japanese spirituality and Zen Buddhism and the kinds of practices that were coming out of Japan and had made their way to the West. But I had never heard of Naikan, which is when I came across you and I read your book. And it was so powerful and transformative. What is Naikan and how does that help meditation?
Well, historically, the roots of Naikan are in the Buddhist tradition called Shin Buddhism in Japan, or Jodo Shinshu, or Pure Land Buddhism, and more globally. And it's the most popular form of Buddhism in Japan. Uh, and it's different from Zen, which is much more, I think, familiar to many people in the West. Um, and the way that I would characterize that contrast, at least until you get deeper into both of these traditions, is that we would say that Zen is characterized by a Japanese term called jiriki, which means self-power, right? And and it's the idea that we have to practice, right? And through our dedicated and consistent and sincere practice, we can somehow reach an experience or a point of realization. Shin Buddhism is characterized by what we would call tariki, which actually means other power. Right? And so it represents the perspective that that there's nothing that we can do without the support or help or dependence on others, right? And so in Shin Buddhism, one of the principles is there is no practice. It doesn't mean you just kind of go and do what you want, but it's the idea that it's really more about this term called shinjin, which used to be translated as faith, right? But faith has a particular connotation, particularly from a Christian tradition. And the most current translation that I like is called true and trusting. True and trusting. So it's the idea of trust. It's the idea that that we go through our life and we have a kind of trust. And then the question is a trust in what? Right? And I would say the best way to say this succinctly is a trust in some power beyond ourselves. Right? And so you could put a word on that power like God or Buddha or Allah or just higher power, right? Or reality. You could insert any of those terms, but the idea is that that we have a certain level of trust in our lives unfolding, and that trust is in some power beyond ourselves. And so Naikan comes from that tradition, and in my opinion, having since all my initial Buddhist training was in Zen, I find it to actually be very complementary to Zen practice. And so, getting back to your question, I think meditation cultivates our way of understanding our mind and understanding our life in a particular way. And I think Naikan reflection, this kind of self-reflection, has a way of cultivating a way of understanding life and a way of understanding our relationships in a particular way. And I see the two of them as actually very complementary. So I still do meditation, and I find it complements my Naikan practice. And we have a number of people who come and do Naikan retreats here at the ToDo Institute, who come from a Zen tradition, who are experienced meditators over a period of years, and often find the experience to be very revealing and very different from going through, for instance, a sesshin where you do meditation for a period of a week. So I see the two as complementary, but maybe having the potential to reveal different things about life and about our understanding of life.
Thank you, Greg. I think that's a wonderful description. And it does sound like two sides of the coin. The way we practice meditation often in the West or, Zen inspired, the idea maybe is we just sit. You sit with your stuff and you just sit and you just sit and you
Hmm.
sit and you sit. And that can become self-absorbed. Or you can do a lot of bypassing in that way because you don't have to, acknowledge things that are there. You can sort of
Hmm.
check into no mind and hang out in that space. What you've just described is the outward looking. you are part of the whole. It's more outward looking and it sort of reconnects you to the big picture.
I think that it's outward looking in the sense that we're looking very directly at our relationships over the course of a particular period of time. And we're looking at actually our conduct in those relationships, right? Through in a very structured kind of way. And so while I think meditation, in my opinion, helps us to see the processes. One thing it helps us with is to see the process of how our mind works, regardless of the content, right?
Mm.
But Naikan actually is looking at the content, right? We're looking at the this question of, how have I been cared for and supported by others, or what have I given to others? We're looking at how we've actually conducted our lives in a very concrete way in different relationships that we've had. So again, I think one complements the other. They both have value, but I think they're very different in terms of the experience of spending the whole day doing Naikan reflection versus spending the whole day doing meditation. One of the teachers I had in the Pure Land Buddhist tradition, Reverend Tsuji, after I had been studying with him for a few years, we had a meditation group on Wednesday night. And ultimately, the structure of that group became we gathered together and we started with a period of about 25 minutes of meditation. I think, similar to the Zen tradition. And then we did a period of kinhin or walking meditation. And then when we sat back down, we did a period of Naikan reflection for about 25 minutes. And then there was some chanting, and then usually we'd have tea and like a little Dharma talk. But I really loved that structure of kind of being able to sit in with our kind of traditional meditation or Zen practice, and then the next time we sat down, we looked at the question of a particular relationship, and it could just be the relationships of the past day, right? So if I was looking at the past day, what I would be reflecting on, what have I received from others during this 24 hours? What have I given, and what troubles and difficulties have I caused? And that became the kind of focus, right, of my time on the cushion.
Naikan sounds very therapeutic, almost Western. Obviously, it's Japanese, but it seems to have a sort of Western therapeutic sense to it.
Well, it's interesting you should say that because I sometimes tell people that the only time that I've ever received hate mail as a result of a presentation or a seminar or something was actually at a conference of mental health professionals, um, and uh, and part of that is that the 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 questions in Naikan are very un-Western from a standpoint of Western psychology, right? So in Western psychology, particularly in therapy, and again, I don't want to generalize because there's so many different approaches to therapy, but in a lot of therapy, over a period of time, you'd spend a lot of time essentially looking at how other people kind of messed up your life, right? And here's this question, the third question in Naikan, which is what troubles and difficulties have I caused others? Which in essence is looking at how have you messed up other people's lives, right? And that's horrific to a lot of Western therapists. Um, Spiritually, to me, is the essential question that we should be looking at. Um, it's the foundation of everything from faith or trust uh, to compassion or love. But from a standpoint of Western psychology, the idea that we would ask a question that might stimulate or prompt any type of experience of guilt or remorse is really heresy in many circles. Um, so I see it, working with these questions, I see as more similar to what you would do as koan study in certain Zen traditions, right? Where you have a koan, a kind of challenging riddle that you're working with. And when you do your meditation, instead of just focusing on your breath, for example, you're actually focusing on the koan that your teacher has given you.
Yeah, well, we just want to feel good, don't we? We don't want to have to implicate ourselves in our lives,
Mhm.
and I can understand that. So I'd like to dive a bit deeper into the format. I mean, you've just given
Okay.
us a sort of brief explanation, but what are the questions and why those questions? What do they unpack?
Okay. Well, those are all good questions. I'm trying to think about them all simultaneously in different parts of my brain. Um, the three questions that I'll go through one by one, and which are very simple, so simple that we work with young children with these questions. But those three questions are the structure of your reflection. And I think when I researched my book originally many decades ago, I found that there were so many spiritual traditions, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, emphasize the value of self-reflection in that tradition. But there were very few actual structures of how to do that self-reflection. And I think that's one of the things that makes Naikan distinctive between just the general idea of, you know, go in the woods for a weekend or something and just reflect on your life, is because you have the structure. And the structure are these three questions. The first question is, what have I received from? And at the end of that sentence would either be a particular person. So, what have I received from my wife? What have I received from my teacher? What have I received from my grandmother or my father or mother? It depends what the focus is of that reflection. So if I'm reflecting on a person, let's say it's my wife, what have I received from my wife during a very defined period of time? Not throughout my whole life, but we've been married for over 30 years, so maybe the last year, right? But it could even be the last month or the last week. The second question is, what have I given? So now we're kind of just turning that around. And so I've looked at the things that my wife has given to me and what she's done for me. And now I'm looking at what I've given to her and what I've done for her. And the third question is, what troubles and difficulties have I caused? Again, in this case, my wife, right? And that's clearly the hardest question. I would also argue it's the most valuable question of the three. And so we use that structure as we look at a particular relationship, but I can also do Naikan on a period of time. So we have something called daily Naikan, which is a type of thing that people who are listening can try. It takes 20, 25 minutes. Often you would do it in the evening at the end of the day, where we just look back at the last 24 hours and we think, what have I received from others? In other words, not just one person, but everybody. Well, my wife went shopping and bought some food for the house, but I also received um, gas or petrol at the station so that I could drive my car, and I received a warm coat because it's very wintry weather out here, and I had something to keep me warm. I received heat in the house. I received electricity and Wi-Fi to do my Zoom call with Mike. So, in other words, everything that I've received is kind of fair game in terms of that focus. And the second question is the same thing. What did I give to others, right? And the third question, again, what troubles did I cause others? So it's a much more open kind of reflection because we're not just focusing on one person, but we're focusing on a very defined and usually short period of time. But the questions really remain the same. The structure really remains the same. And so I mentioned daily Nikon, which is the simplest way to do this and takes a very limited amount of time. The other extreme is a Nikon retreat, which is traditionally a 1 week retreat. It can be longer, but it's traditionally a 1 week retreat in which a person over the course of 7 days does about 100 hours of reflection and reflects on every person that's played some kind of meaningful or important role in their life. So that usually starts with your mother, your father, maybe your siblings, maybe all your relationships, starting with your first serious relationship, when you were in your teens or 20s, and then your ex-wife, now your current wife, or your ex-husband and current husband, and your spiritual teachers, and your basketball coach, and your piano teacher. And in other words, you actually come out at the end of the week having considered your relationship with everybody who's had some significance in your life. Um, and that, for me, was a very, very profound experience. The first time I did that in Japan, you couldn't do it anywhere else at that time. And so I continued doing those retreats in Japan every year for about 5 years. Um, I found that what I was seeing about those relationships, which meant what I was seeing about my life, was incredibly informative, in some cases very shocking and surprising, um, and really influenced not only how I understood my life in the past, because you're looking at your past, but it very much influenced how I understood my life in the present as I woke up and went into my day, and how I understood the way my life might unfold and how to work with that in terms of the future. So it had, while you're looking at the past, it can have a very dramatic impact on how you live in the present and how you cope with or handle moving forward in terms of the future.
New spirit, new spirit, new spirit.
As you were explaining it there and how it changed your life and making you more aware of your relationship with life, I thought of the Socratic phrase, know thyself. And in the West here, we might go to a relationship counselor or a relationship therapist, but that deals with one relationship, you and your partner, you and your husband or
Mm-hmm.
wife. But what you're saying is your relationship with life, with all of life, with everything
Mm-hmm.
that makes you and forms you and how what you do ripples back into that big picture.
I think that many of us, all of us, many of us, certainly me, we have a story that we've built up over the course of our years, right? And my personal story before I got discovered this type of reflection was family violence, right? And so I grew up in a home where there was family violence, and sometimes that violence led to the police being called. Sometimes it led to somebody going to the hospital. And as I got older, even after I left my home, that was kind of my story of my early years, right? So if I was dating someone and we were getting to know each other and maybe talking about, our past and our experiences in the past, if I was to tell my story, I would tell this story about what it was like growing up in a family that had all this violence. But when I went to Japan and I did this retreat in which I looked at my entire life, and including all of those years, until I left for college, so almost the first 20 years of my life. But in relation to my mom and dad and my brother and all these other people in my life, I found there were all these other things that happened that weren't part of my story. And that included getting swimming lessons, receiving piano lessons. My father bought a piano, even though we didn't have a lot of money, so that I could have a piano to learn and practice on. Um, uh, my mother worked a second job, and my father used to pick me up and take me to school because uh, in the winters in Chicago, where I grew up, the winters were very harsh, and otherwise I would have had to walk. And so I saw all of these ways in which I was supported and cared for and loved during this period of life. But my story was simply family violence. So what happened is as I went through that retreat, my story started to crumble, right? And it didn't really crumble because it wasn't true. It was true, but only up to a limited point, right? And as I looked at the fact that we went on vacations to Florida and to Wisconsin, and I got to ride horses sometimes, and what I realized is that theme of family violence was really a sub-theme of a much larger story in which I was very much loved and cared for and supported by a variety of people, not just my parents in my life, my teachers. I played basketball. I loved basketball. I had a basketball coach. And so that story, I had to essentially abandon that story, not because I chose to do so. It just didn't hold up anymore, right? And that's, to me, one of the things that happens when we step back and look at our life, that it starts to change our story in most cases. And I think one of the reasons is that if you go back and look at those questions, when we reflect on our life with those kinds of questions, it's as if we're temporarily looking at the conduct, the back and forth conduct in our relationships without what I call the emotional coloring of those events. An example of what I mean is that, let's say my wife got in and I got into an argument on a Tuesday night, right? And we get up Wednesday morning and there's a lot of tension, and but she makes coffee and she gives me a cup of coffee, right? And so I'm receiving that coffee, but I'm inside, I'm still angry at her, right? So it's not like I'm grateful for the coffee. I'm just, yeah, thanks for the coffee. I made you coffee the last like week in a row or something, you know. So I've got all these thoughts going on and this inner dialogue and these feelings. Um, and that colors that event, right? But if we really set aside that emotional coloring and we just look at the fact is my wife made me coffee and gave me a cup of coffee. That's just the fact, right? Or I used an example in one of my books or my writing about a person who lives in New York and they have an argument with their wife and they commute to work on the subway, and the wife drives the husband to work and they're not speaking, right? And he's furious at something she said or did. And then they get to the subway stop where he gets off and he gets out of the car. And the question is, does he thank her for the ride? Right? Because the fact is that she drove him to the subway stop. So when we're doing Naikan reflection, we're leaving out all of this emotional coloring. And you'll notice that the first question is very carefully phrased. It's what have I received from others? And if you look at a lot of positive psychology and the gratitude movement, the question tends to be framed around what am I grateful for? But what I'm grateful for depends on my mood. It's a question that is very feeling based, right? If I'm in a wonderful mood, I could be grateful for the rain, right? If I'm in a spiritual mood, I could be grateful for the rain. But if I'm in a rotten mood that day, even though someone gives me a wonderful present, right, or buys me lunch, I'm not going to be grateful because it's just based on my mood. So if we ask the question, what am I grateful for? We're now essentially leaving out all of these aspects of our life that are supporting us because we basically don't have the feeling of gratitude. But when we ask the question, what am I receiving from others? It leaves out whether we feel grateful or not, right? It just has us look at the fact. You know, someone bought me lunch, someone drove me to the subway stop, someone made me coffee, someone interviewed me on their podcast. And it's not that we don't have those feelings. We're not trying to deny. It just means that our reflection is really looking at the actual reality of our life and without the coloring of our feeling state at any given moment. Does that make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense to me. We have this story, our story, my story, which is like a single thread in a large piece of fabric.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe Naikan helps us realize that, you know, there's the rest of the threads and it weaves together this bigger picture. Why do we have so much difficulty seeing, accessing the fabric? Why is our nose to the ground and we can't see anything else around us?
Well, it's a good question. I think it's one of the things sometimes gets revealed in that reflection, is that on the one hand, we may see things as we go through our life and kind of dig deeper into these different relationships that we've had over the course of our lifetime. We actually ask in a retreat, we actually ask people to make a map of these different relationships and when they occurred. You know, if you're 40 or 50 or 60 years old. And of course, there's a lot of relationships that started at one point and then ended. They ended because the relationship dissolved, or they ended because someone died, or someone moved, or something like that. But often there's a lot of relationships. So, on the one hand, we may see how much care and support and love we've received from other people and objects, even um, in the course of our life, which gives us a sense of feeling loved, which is a very nice feeling, right? But we might also see from the third question all the ways in which we've acted in selfish ways, in mean ways, in hostile ways, um, our conduct, which has actually caused, whether intentionally or unintentionally, problems and inconveniences and suffering to others. So we see this side of us. Um, which is the side that mostly we don't want to see, right? We see our own self-centeredness. In Buddhism, in Japanese Buddhism, there's a term called Bono, Bonno, and it means something like all of our angry, self-centered, ego-centered passions, right? So we think about this idea that within us is this part of us that is very ego-centered and self-centered, and just is really concerned about ourself. It's part of us that sees ourself as the center of the world, right? And when we see that, that's not a very pleasant thing to see at all.
Mm.
And so we're seeing these two things simultaneously, right? That the world has been much more caring and loving and supportive than maybe we had um, uh, observed at the time. But also, we've been often very self-centered and ego-centered and mean and the source of suffering or trouble to others much more than we acknowledged at the time. And that experience of seeing that aspect of our lives um, and how we've been in that way, and the aspect in which people have given us and cared for us so much, creates a lot of turbulence, right, in our mind, in our heart, and in our spiritual life, right? And I would argue that that's a very healthy turbulence to have. Um, there's, I can't remember his name, but there's a man who won the Nobel Prize in Science many years ago um, for looking at what amounts to friction, right? And you may have heard this before, the idea that nothing grows without friction,
Mm.
whether it's a plant or whether it's a relationship or whether it's our spiritual selves, right? Without friction, there's no growth. And this creates a lot of friction. And so it opens up the possibility for growth in that sense. I would say growth at a psychological level, at a relationship level, but also at a spiritual level.
I remember years ago reading about the third question and how, as you say, it's very uncomfortable to note down all the ways which you've sort of misbehaved during the day because it goes against our sort of treasured self-image. But as you say, it's spiritual practices to be open and vulnerable and to admit that you can be wrong and self-centered. But I remember thinking, have you ever seen the film Back to the Future 2?
I've seen all three of them, so I'm not sure which one is which, but the answer to your question is yes, I'm pretty certain I've seen that film.
Well, so there's the bit in the second film where Marty McFly goes back again to the 1950s and he has to avoid himself.
Mhm.
He can't suddenly, run into himself. He has to hide watching himself. I remember thinking, oh, it's a bit like that. If I could follow Mike around for one day and just
Mhm.
stay hidden, what would Mike be like in real life? Because I have my image of how I would be,
Mhm.
but maybe I'm a complete asshole.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm an idiot, but you get that objectivity with your life by answering that question.
Yes, yes. So let me ask you about a movie. Have you seen the movie Defending Your Life with Meryl
No.
Streep and Albert Brooks? Okay, so that movie came out just as I was doing my Naikan retreats back in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think it's probably still available someplace on some streaming service. But the premise of the movie, and I'll tell you enough without spoiling it, but the premise of the movie is Albert Brooks dies very quickly in the film. And he ends up going to this place that's kind of a stopover this is what happens to you after you die. And so he's in this place, and in this place, this is where they decide where you're going to go from here, right? Are you going to kind of move forward, as they say, move forward, or do you go back and try again? And the way they decide that is they assign you someone that represents you in your life. And they don't call these people lawyers, but they look a lot like lawyers, right? So they're on your side, right? But then there's a prosecutor. Again, they don't call them that, but they're on the other side. And then there's some people who are on a panel who are really judges, but again, they don't call them that. But you go into these sessions, and what happens is your side shows actual video clips of your life, like Mike when he was 8 years old, and Mike when he broke up with his first relationship, and they show these clips, and they show the clips that basically make you look like you had courage and you were very loving and very compassionate and very wise. But then the other side shows these other clips, like you know, basically having a fire and running out of the house without saving your children or something, like, you know, things that show that you were a coward and that you were self-centered and ego-centered, and it goes back and forth like this, right? And then this panel decides, you know, where you're going to go, right? Are you going to go back on Earth and try again, be reborn again, and try again, or do you move forward in whatever that means in the movie? And so I saw that movie when I was in the midst of doing these week-long retreats, and I realized my retreats had a certain similarity because it was like seeing little video clips of my life based on these questions, right? And again, everybody has a different experience, but for me, you know, there were actually images that came up. You know, when I had an image of my dad dropping me off at my piano lesson with Mrs. Braverman and walking into her house and sitting at the piano and lying to her about that I had practiced the Mexican hat dance song when I had not even practiced it once. So I had these very clear images, even though these were things that happened, you know, at that time, 20, 30 years earlier. And it was a lot like just stepping back and being in solitude and just seeing a screen which had these little video clips of your life, some of which, you know, made you feel really good about your life because it showed all these people who were doing nice things for you and showed you doing nice things for other people, and some of which you didn't feel particularly enjoy seeing those clips because they showed you all the things you were ashamed of and all the things that you regret doing and all the ways that you hurt other people. But there's a Zen teacher, a female Zen teacher by the name of Reverend Shundo Ayama, and she has a wonderful way of, I think, describing this. She says that, you know, you go through your life, and each day you have your life, and what transpires that day is your karma, right? It's like the book of your life. So you're writing the book of your life based on how you live each day, and a big part of that is how you conduct yourself in relation to the rest of the world. And she says, whether or not you see what's on that page, it doesn't negate the fact that there's a page, right? So in other words, if you've done something that was really selfish, right, to someone, right, and you just dismiss it because you say, "Oh, I couldn't help it," or "It was the other person's fault," or something like that. But what she's saying is that it's your karma, whether or not you see it or not. In other words, part of the way that I would view Naikan reflection is that it's an opportunity to come face to face with our karma, right? And whether we want to be conscious of our karma, including the parts of our karma that we don't feel very good about or not, doesn't change the fact that it's our karma. Right? So what's the real choice? The choice is, do I want to move forward in my life being conscious of my karma up to now, or not being conscious of it? Right? And it's not that Naikan makes you 100% conscious of it, but it makes you more conscious of it than I think, at least for me, than I was before I went through that process. And even just reflecting on a day, I don't know what your experience is, Mike, but even just spending a few minutes reflecting on a day often brings things to the front of your consciousness that maybe you didn't really remember or pay much attention to, but now that you're just sitting and reflecting, you're conscious of it in a different kind of way. And so that's, from a spiritual standpoint, that's one of the ways I look at this work, is that it's giving us the opportunity to become conscious of our karma, meaning that we become conscious of the book that we've written. I just turned 70, so I've got 70 years, you know, in this book I've written, and I'm more conscious of it if I'm reflecting on my life than if I'm not.
mean, I talk a lot about interdependence, and I know Naikan sort of reveals that. You pull on one thing, and the whole universe is attached to it.
Yeah, very, very much, and that's where I think you see this Buddhist principle of interdependence, and this principle of interdependence that I think comes out in a very concrete, practical way when we do Nikon reflection. Um, Both are counter to often the main um, uh, message that we have in Western society about, a person's a self-made man or a self-made woman, or, I want to make enough money so that I have independence, even in the U.S., that we have Independence Day. I often post something on that day that we should really call it Interdependence Day, right? But the Western system it has much stronger message that I think we raise our children within that messaging system that that we're really it's really important. Independence is really important, and we do that by I think giving minimal attention to what I think is a much more not just important but a much more true principle of interdependence.
We like to imagine that we're self-driven and
Mhm.
self-propelled, but that's also a prison, that
Mhm.
little, prison cell of me that's not
Mhm.
connected to the flowers and the trees and the clouds and the stranger. In Islam, right at the start of the Quran,
Mhm.
when Muhammad is meditating in the cave and Angel Gabriel appears, he says, "Allah made you from a blood clot." And I always think that's the interdependence.
Mhm.
You're not this self-made cellular structure with, you didn't design your hand or something. You're part of this huge, vast, ultimately unknowable isness. Allah made you from a blood clot. You're not this independent, self-propelled entity that we sort of imagine we are.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is we can see those kinds of that interdependence principle in spiritual teachings, in this case in Islam, certainly in Buddhism. I think also in maybe some of the more mystic forms of Christianity and Judaism. But what Nikon does is it's showing us that interdependence in our practical lives just on a daily basis, right? Like if we just take a minute here and how would we have this conversation, right, without electricity, without the internet, on my end, without a microphone, without a computer, without a camera, without, I couldn't even be sitting, it's very cold out today. I couldn't even be sitting here talking to you without heat in the house, right? But also without my hearing, right? Without my eyesight. Um, so I could continue probably through the rest of our interview listing things that make this interview possible just from my end of things. And that's a very concrete way of understanding interdependence, right? So we're able to kind of connect the concrete daily connections in our life that are very practical with the kind of spiritual teachings, like the story that you just mentioned about Allah, and we see that this is really the same thing. That what Nikon is simply doing is it's allowing us to see our lives at this very moment from a standpoint of maybe one of the highest principles of spirituality, interdependence.
Where does this lead, as it were? You mentioned Pure Land Buddhism, the idea of nirvana or liberation,
Mm-hmm.
enlightenment, spiritual growth. I mean, I can see how psychologically you can develop your psychology, you can advance or evolve your appreciation, your gratitude, your sense of being, that you're
Mm-hmm.
part of this huge thing called a cosmos. Is that the direction it goes, or does it take us to a different understanding ultimately, or maybe there isn't an endpoint to this reflection?
Well, I think the question of where does it lead is a really valid question, and uh, I think the question for you as a human being is where does this lead for me, right? And the question for me is where does this lead for me? And I've been working with this method of self-reflection for more than 30 years and running retreats and working with people in retreats. And to be honest with you, as I get older and I work with this material longer, it becomes more of a mystery to me. I could tell you the impact that it's had on me in many ways, but probably the most simple, straightforward one is just that when I first went to Japan and did my first retreat, um, I was in my early 30s and had a very difficult relationship with my mother ever since I was a kid. I was a very rebellious child all the way through my teen years. I couldn't wait to get out of my house. I had a very angry attitude and resentful attitude towards my mother. My characterization of her was very negative and offensive in some ways. Uh, and when I did my retreat, it changed my understanding of her and my relationship with her in a way that changed our relationship for the rest of my life. And so it's possible, but unlikely, that I would have had the same relationship with her moving forward into the next 25 years had I not done this type of reflection. So one of the places for me that it led was it essentially healed and resolved this very deep conflict that had developed between my mother and I, to a lesser extent with my father as well. So those relationships transformed themselves, right? And not necessarily because of some effort that I made, but because of I saw them in a very different way, a different light. Um, so on that plane, that's one of the ways that it I think affected my life. But where does it lead spiritually? I think that's different for each person. I think um, we're all at a different place on our own path, right? And so, does a process like this open doors? I think that's quite possible. That would be a nice way to look at it. It may open some doors that weren't opened for you or someone else before, but those doors may be very different doors than they were for me, right? And so I think that the most honest answer I could give you is that even for myself, it would be hard to really accurately say where did this lead. But for anybody else, including people who I've listened to for a week and learned about their whole life, I really can't say where it leads. And I think that's part of looking at things as uh, that there is some power beyond self in the universe, that there, whether you call it Buddha or higher power or Allah, but also that we begin to see the limits of our control, right? I think that was one of the lessons that I really learned from this. Is I became much more conscious of the control and things that were not in control in terms of my life unfolding, and the ability to recognize grace when it's present, and the ability to trust that grace will be there when it's needed. For me, those were things that kind of became part of, I think, my experience moving forward. But what it would mean for you or anybody else listening, um, I just really don't know. I think that the knowledge of how to answer that is beyond my own control or power.
No, I think that's a lovely answer. And like all these paths, you have to start on the path in order to find out what's waiting for you
Mhm.
at the end, or that there is no end to that path. Doing Naikan for a parent or a partner or one of your children or a stranger, I can see that really opening doors for people, being especially with our parents being extremely healing. But I've also heard you talk about Naikan for objects, mundane objects. One of my favorite things to talk about is the miraculous mundane. How would one do Naikan for an object, a shoe or a chair. And why would one do that?
First of all, that's a great way to frame the question. Why would you do Naikan on an object, right? Because an object is lifeless, right? And so, but again, that's a very Western perspective, right? So, in different traditions, including Eastern traditions, including Native American traditions, objects are not lifeless. In they may be lifeless in the sense that they don't breathe and they don't have scientifically life within them. But in a Zen monastery, it's often seen that the cook is passing on kind of the energy or the vibes or the compassion or whatever you want to call it in the food that it's cooking for the monastics in that monastery, and so I think that that's very true of a lot of objects that there can be a certain kind of energy, if you want to call it, that object carries with it, or a certain kind of karma, depending on where it's been. But I think that the way that I would see it, let's use a real example like shoes. Okay, so I'm going to use the slipper. I'm wearing slippers right now in the house. We have a kind of Japanese type of tradition. We don't wear our shoes in the house, and I never wore slippers for many years. And my wife got me these slippers, and I said thank you, but I was kind of thinking I don't wear slippers. I can't really use them. But one point I started wearing them, and I got to really like them, right? And the more as I aged and as I became more conscious of the winter, and we have wood floors can get very cold, they give me very practical benefits of having these slippers. Now, if I come into the house and I don't put them on, I feel kind of naked, right? But the fact is that these slippers are helping me. They're supporting me in a very practical way. They're protecting my feet. They're keeping my feet warm. They have a certain the level of firmness. It gives my ankles and Achilles heel and everything a certain kind of physical support. Um, and so I'm receiving benefits from these slippers, right? And the question um, is it good to acknowledge those benefits, or is it unnecessary to acknowledge those benefits? So what I would say is the question of whether it's good for the slippers to acknowledge those benefits, I'm not really sure about that. But what I'm sure about is that it's good for me to acknowledge those benefits, because uh, if I can if I can practice in a way that includes things like my slippers or my eyeglasses, right? Then again, it just moves me more in the direction of recognizing interdependence, but also it's recognizing that my slippers are supporting me is the same process as recognizing that my friend who plowed our driveway of snow, or the person in our band who, played some music with me, that they're supporting me, right? They're a living thing, and my slippers aren't. But in terms of how my attention works, it's the same process of being aware of how the world is supporting you. So I think it's really helpful for me to notice, as you called it, what was the term,
Miraculous mundane.
the miraculous mundane. I think it's really important. But while I can't say how it is from the slippers viewpoint, it's really important in terms of me to be able to acknowledge the support that they're playing in all of the inanimate objects in my life. Um, Otherwise, I just take those things for granted. And I'm very skilled at taking things for granted because I just did that really elegantly for the first half of my life. Everything, people, the mundane, everything. And so working with my attention to recognize these things, whether it be my favorite knife or my favorite cutting board in the kitchen when I'm cooking, or my favorite microphone when I'm singing, and performing music. That recognition, have you ever heard of a form of music education called Suzuki music education?
I
It's
haven't.
from Japan, and it was developed by this man Shinichi Suzuki. Um, but we introduced our children to music when they were, probably 5 and 4, 5, 6 years old. And we started them on violin. And I remember, the teachers have to go through their own education in this method of musical education. And the first lesson in learning the violin was basically how to open the case and bow to the violin and pick up the violin and then put it back in the case and bow to it and close the case. That's all they did for the first lesson. Right? And I didn't know that in advance. I loved that. Right? I
Yeah.
thought it was really brilliant that we introduced children to the idea of having this respect for your instrument if you're going to play music on an instrument, that you have this respect, that you take a even just a second and you put your hands together and you bow, acknowledging that you want to thank the instrument for allowing you to be able to play it.
I love that. There's so much meaning and so much, purpose and relevance to the world when you see it in that way. And it always makes me think of Van Gogh's chair, his painting of his chair. It's
Hmm.
just a chair. It's an old
Hmm.
sort of, straw, chair,
Hmm.
but it's just on fire with personality, and I always wonder, him choosing something so mundane to bring to life in that way.
Hmm.
Yeah, the mundane has so much meaning. Oh, I might have lost you there, Greg.
You know, I have to tell you this funny story that I heard. This isn't my story, but um, I've been flying since for work and pleasure since I was probably about 20 years old. It's changed quite a bit, and it's not that long ago. You may remember this, but it's not that long ago that Wi-Fi became available on airplanes. Right, that was unheard of for decades. Right, and so this again, this wasn't my experience, but this person wrote this story about sitting next to this guy who was like a businessman, and they said, we're happy to announce that on this flight we actually have Wi-Fi, so you can connect your laptop or something, and you'll be able to connect to the internet, right? And this is like the first time anyone's ever heard that, so they're very thrilled. And so this businessman, he connects, and it's like, sure enough, he can send emails and receive emails. And then in about 10 minutes the Wi-Fi goes down, right? And he starts swearing and swearing, like, what the he's like, he goes to this tantrum, like he never had Wi-Fi in his life. And then like suddenly it goes down, and it's like, why can't they get their act together? So I think, when that kind of thing happens, when we just kind of broke up there for a moment, it's actually a great reminder of what an amazing thing it is that we can have this visual and auditory conversation, right? Because you have this little period of 30 seconds where we can't, and then you think like, oh my goodness. But then you realize, wow, this is really amazing that we're doing this.
It is amazing. I mean, I think maybe the thing about Naikan, you sort of shine a light on the incredible nature of ordinary things, and it brings a sense of awe and
Mm.
wonder, childlike wonder to things. There's a question that I often ask people just to sort of finish, and I wonder what your response would be, which is based on your experience of practicing and teaching Naikan and this way of looking at the world, where one is, intimately woven from it and giving back to it. What do people need to know?
I would say that it's valuable. We could say to know yourself, but that's kind of conceptual. But I think it's valuable, and sometimes relationship saving, to be able to see yourself and observe how you are living and how you're conducting yourself in relationship to others, and to recognize that the story that we've created about who we are and how we handle our relationships and our relationship problems is probably not an accurate story. And anybody who's listened to a couple that is on the verge of divorce and listened to them talk about their criticisms of the other partner knows that neither partner has an accurate view, right, of themselves ourselves or the other person. And so if we go into a process of introspection and self-reflection as an experiment, as a research project, and this is really the essence of how I teach this work, is that you're taking on a research project, and the subject of that research project is your life, right? And as with most research projects, you start out by collecting data. And you collect data by taking some time, a few minutes, an hour, here and there, once a week, once a month, every evening. You start collecting data using these three questions. So as you look at the past day, what have I received from others? Each answer is data, right? What have I given? Each answer is data. What troubles have I caused? The same thing. And so you start collecting data, and over time, in a limited amount of data in any research has a limited amount of value. But if you do this enough, you start getting enough data where you can start drawing some conclusions. And those are conclusions about who you are, how you've lived, and how the world works. And those conclusions may be very different than the conclusions you've drawn up to the time that you started your research. So, so I like to encourage people, in order to work with this Greek principle of know thyself, to take on this kind of research project. It may ultimately lead you to doing a one-week retreat, but just start very simply. Just take those three questions, sit down for 5 minutes today, and if you want to start a journal, that's a good way to do it. But otherwise, just use a piece of scratch paper and answer those questions and see what you come up with. Because I do think that, to me, having worked with this material for so long, I think it's something that everybody should do before they die. I think you will die differently, and you will say goodbye to the people you've been in a relationship with differently if you take on this research project. So I consider it to be one of the most profound things that I've ever done. I have no idea, for each of you who is listening, where this will lead for you, but I think it's worth doing.